Hello everybody. Today I want to introduce you a new friend, Mr. Daniel Defoe. So, Daniel was born in London, probably in September 1660. We say probably because his father was a nonconformist merchant. He was belonging to an extremely Protestant sect which didn't accept certain rules or religious ceremonies of the state church, so the Anglican Church. And so he refused to register his son's birth in the books of his parish. So that's why we have doubts about the actual date of birth. So, brought up as a dissenter, young Daniel studied at the College of Stoke Newington, where he received a solid dissenting education. Um, Basically, in the school, he was not studying a classical subject, but practical subject. For practical subject, we intend foreign languages or geography, so not Greek and Latin. After school, his father wanted him to become a parish, but Daniel didn't want to follow an ecclesiastic career. So in 1680, finishing school, he decided to become a merchant, dealing in various products such as wine or tobacco. By the way, his father too was a merchant, was a butcher actually. After he traveled for 2 or 3 years in Europe because of his business, and when he came back in England, he opened an haberdasher's shop. He got married and also he began to be interested in politics. In 1685, he put aside his business and he took part in the rebellion against James II, that was the Roman Catholic king. Of course, the rebellion didn't go well, as we know, and Daniel was able to escape the punishment. And in 1688, he joined the army of William of Orange. Anyway, as he put aside his business for a long time, at a certain time in 1692, he went bankrupt. Um, he managed to pay back most of his debts, but faced with the new need to make up for from the money loss, he ventured into many other activities, including journalism and literature. And with this, he started to have some popularity and even the friendship of the king. In 1702, Queen Anne, as we know, became queen, and as we know, she was proudly Anglican and a supporter of the state church. So, when Defoe published satirical pamphlets in defense of the dissenters, he had some heavy troubles. The pamphlet that he wrote was anonymous, and its title was The Shortest Way with the Dissenters. The pamphlet intention was to mock the high Anglican position, and the authorities so were certainly not amused by that. The identity of the author was quickly discovered, and a substantial reward was offered for his arrest. Was wanted as in the Far West. So Defoe went into hiding and published from there a brief explanation of a late pamphlet to say that he had been misunderstood, but he was betrayed by someone that wanted to have the reward in money. So he was caught a few months after, and he was confined in the prison of Newgate. He was released after 6 months on bail, and he had to face his trial. He decided to plead guilty, as technically he was, and he appealed for mercy, saying that he had not meant to be taken seriously in his pamphlet. So finally was sentenced to stand 3 times in the pillory and to pay an expensive fine. The pillory was used to punish minor offenders, including cheats, liars, rioters, and homosexuals, because to be homosexual was a crime until the 19th century. And they were exposed to be shamed in public. They were liable to be pelted by the crowd with rotten eggs, fruits, dead cats and dogs, mud, and every variety of filth. And also, in extreme cases, people were throwing them stones that caused serious injury. Some were killed or maimed for life because of that. So when Daniel was put in the pillory on the 3 last day of July, it was the summer, it was decided that for each of these 3 days he had to be exposed for 1 hour, and it was exposed in 3 of the busiest places in London. It seems that during these 3 days it rained steadily most of the time, which, though it was uncomfortable, this would have kept the crowds down. Um, and this was something that was good for Daniel, but it seems especially that nobody wanted to hurt him. And all was thrown at him were flowers by his admirers. And meanwhile, his friends they were selling the spectators copies of The Shortest Way and a hymn to the pillory that Daniel had composed for the occasion. So because of that, Daniel was sent back in the prison of Newgate, and his brickworks were went bankrupt. Because as he was in prison, he could not take care of his business, so he could not pay his fine, and then the poor Daniel started to feel really depressed. The government, meanwhile, started to consider the fact that probably Daniel could be useful to the government. So instead of keeping him in prison, in November, mysteriously, Daniel's fine was paid. And this was a secret found. Nobody knew where this money were coming from. Well, Daniel in the beginning thought that was a miracle, but then he discovered that he was rescued by the leader of the Tory party, Mr. Harley. And in exchange, Daniel promised not to write against the government anymore for the rest of his life. And in the end, in 1705, he was asked to become a spy and secret agent for the government. In 1704, he started his famous newspaper that was called The Review. This newspaper was almost entirely written by him. He continued with that until 1713, and it was published regularly during these years. Then in 1719, when Daniel was already 60 years old, suddenly he dropped journalism and started writing prose fiction. This was certainly not because he had literary or artistic purposes, but consider the fact that this new genre, the novel fiction, was so popular, so he considered it as a kind of business activity. And in this field, he produced a remarkable number of works. And actually, we remember him because of that. Well, to finish his life, unfortunately, the last days of his life were dismal and unhappy. He was compelled to adopt another pen name for concealment, and he died alone and friendless in 1731. So, to conclude about his life, I just want you to consider the fact that when he died, Daniel was about 70 years old. But during his life, he had seen six kings on the throne of England. Also, he had lived through political controversies, religious persecutions, party conflicts, transformations, and wars. And during his life, also, think about his experiences. He was a tradesman, a secret agent, a spy. He was in prison. Then, after, he became a journalist, and only in the end of his life, he became a writer. And as a writer, we now remember him as the father of the modern English novel as we know it today. He accumulated a lot of works, not only in literature, I mean narrative, but also as a journalist during his career. So let's have a look on his works. So in his works, we have to remember, among others, his career as a journalist. What he published in the review called The Review from 1704 to 1713. This was published three times a week, and it was mainly political in character. Then the pamphlets, like The Shortest Way with the Dissenters in 1702, in which Defoe, as a dissenter himself, ironically advocated the total suppression of all dissenters. So this was an evident attack against ecclesiastic intolerance, and this was the reason why also he had so many troubles about that. We have to remember also some poems that he wrote, like The True-Born Englishman in 1701, that was a versus satire against William III's enemies. The Hymn of to the Pillory in 1703, that was the bestseller, that it was sold to the crowd, which had gathered around the pillory while he was there, and it was a mock Pindari code. Also, we have to remember, of course, his novels. The first one, the most famous one, in 1719, is Robinson Crusoe. So the account of Robinson Crusoe's life on a desert island. Then the year after, in 1720, Captain Singleton, relating the adventures of a captain who became a pirate. Then in 1722, the fortunes and misfortunes of Moll Flanders. You can call it just Moll Flanders. And it's a novel that is presented as the autobiography of a woman who was able to survive in the slums of the 18th century in London, and this was thanks to her beauty and also using sex, and so becoming a thief and a prostitute. Moll Flanders was born from her mother, that was a thief, inside the prison of Newgate. So, of course, Daniel took inspiration by his own experience.
Her innocence.
Though she sold her body to survive, she refused to sell her soul.
Well, I'm not going to fear any man of flesh and blood, no matter what costume he wears.
She taught me the true meaning of courage.
100 guineas.
100 guineas, that's put a price on it.
The same year, also he published Colonel Jack. There is the story of a pickpocket who in the end repented and reached wealth and prosperity. 2 years later, in 1724, he published Lady Roxana, called also just Roxana, that is presented like, again, an autobiography of a courtesan, was finally imprisoned for debts and died a penitent.
Captain Reynolds. Pleasure.
The other works, like the Journal of the Plague Year and Robbers and Escape of John Shepherd, are less famous, and so we will not talk about that. So now we go to analyze his style. Despite the many works that he wrote, Daniel's fame rests almost entirely on his novels. He was already 60 when he became a novelist, and in a way he had to come to terms with his Puritan ideas, according to which fiction was a form of lying and consequently wrong. So to justify his works, he decided to write so-called true stories. All his stories were containing also a moral teaching, and in the preface or in the text of each of his work, he said that it takes pain to insist that he had just presented the facts, the real facts, and his only purpose is the highly moral desire to convert the vice into virtue. So this conception of fiction led him to write novels which more or less all share the same features. The first one is realism. They are usually presented in the form of a diary or an autobiography related in the first person singular in order to increase the verisimilitude. Then we have a lack of structure, because there's not a real plot, but a sequence of events that are unrolling in a chronological order around the same protagonist. Then we have the lack of characterization, because the characters do not develop during the story. What changes, in fact, is only their external condition, while inside they remain the same. Then we have individualism, because there's only one main character, that is a hero or a heroine, who is resolute in spirit, compelled to struggle again against a lot of misfortunes, and to rely only upon himself or herself for survival. This feature was in keeping both with the Puritan idea that is in himself that man must find his salvation, but also with the image of the Augustan age, So the Augustan new man, that is a self-made man, businessman, who can advance economically through his own work. Then we have isolation, because the characters, the protagonists are alone, not only physically as Robinson Crusoe or that is on the island, but also socially, like Roxana or like Moll Flanders. In the case of these two women, they are alone because they live in a male-oriented society. Also, we have no sentimentalism. Um, there are very few tears and despair, even in the most tragic situations. Every day, the characters is struggling, but not for ideals or passion, but they struggle to survive. They fight for their daily bread. Uh, Common sense, therefore, usually prevails together with the practical pursuit of money. We also have moral attitude. All the novels contain prayers and expression of gratitude to God, and they all end with the protagonist repenting for what they have done. This moral conclusion, however, sounds a bit ambiguous. First, because it's not implicit in the character's action, and then because it looks like a kind of sweetener added to the coarseness of the story. So, let's say, just to respect the moral. Also, in all his most important novels, we can find elements that we can define as picaresque, because the stories are presented as autobiographies of the character that is describing his or her own experiences. Secondly, because they are episodic in structure, and also because some characters are characters that they exploit the society in which they live in. There are sometimes also a direct or indirect satire of the 18th century English society. So that's why we can say that these novels have picaresque elements.